welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian. First up this week, a commute plan to sustain sanity, 22nd of January 2015. A recent study by the Australasian Railway Association suggests Perth commuters should leave the car at home and utilise public transport. The West, 20th of January 2015. Let's look at it from an Ellenbrook resident's perspective. There is no direct rail link to the city, and never will be according to the state government during the last election. So if I set off on my epic journey to start work at 8:30am, I have to leave my house at 6:27am, walk to my first bus. Then I catch a second bus to Bassendean. Next, I catch a train to Perth and change trains there to arrive at Esplanade Station. The Transperth Journey Planner tells me it will take 88 minutes. This is just the morning commute. Google Maps says I can drive it in 41 minutes. So for a saving of 94 minutes per day, which over an entire year equates to 44 of my working days, I think I'll be keeping my car and my sanity. Narinda Rossi, Averley. This is the problem with Perth and public transport. It's not that it takes twice as long to get anywhere by train or bus. That is a part of the problem. And yes, we do need more rail, especially to places like Ellenbrook. But a big part of the problem here is that people expect to be able to live somewhere like Ellenbrook, which is 20 kilometres from the CBD, where this person works, and they expect to have a relatively straightforward commute. This is an unrealistic expectation. This person has bought a house, presumably, in Ellenbrook, which is 20 kilometres away from the CBD and is on the sort of outer edge of Perth, and yet still expects to have a trouble-free commute to and from work on a daily basis. That is not a reasonable expectation. Once upon a time in Perth, the idea was you could live pretty much anywhere and work anywhere else in Perth, and that would be fine. We have a large urban sprawl now. We are much bigger than we ever have been. That is no longer a reasonable expectation. So it's not actually the public transport system's problem in this particular case, because even if there was decent public transport, you would still be looking at a long commute time of at least an hour, probably. The problem is that people in Perth don't take into account things like where they work when they look at where they want to live. So people expect to be able to, they say, well, I want to own a house on a block of land. Where am I going to buy one of those? Well, it'll have to be in the outer suburbs. Okay, so I'm going to buy my, house in the outer suburbs, but I'm still going to expect to be able to work anywhere in Perth and not have particular issues with commuting. And that is just ridiculous. I used to work well outside of the Perth metropolitan area, and a lot of the people that I worked with were commuting for at least an hour to get there and back. And lots of people had no intention whatsoever to move. They just complained that there was no public transport. They just complained that they had to drive so far to their work. This is an unreasonable expectation, and it's unreasonable. A lot of the unreasonableness is founded on our car culture, that we just expect that we should be able to drive anywhere in some kind of reasonable time without much traffic or hassle on the way. And then we double our expectations when it comes to public transport, like somehow they're supposed to be more convenient than cars. They're never going to be. Even the best of public transports, if you have these unrealistic expectations, it's never going to be as good as you're hoping for. Next up, Halal food certification, 22nd of January 2015. Big companies, among them Kraft Foods and Cadbury, are paying big amounts of money for displaying the halal symbol on their products. This logo is so small that most people are not aware of it and probably wouldn't recognise it for what it is anyway. No other religious organisation has solicited funds for displaying their logo, so why are companies falling for this? If the Islamic community did not support companies who refused to comply or were forbidden to do so, would it make so much difference to their turnover? This practice, together with the employment of Muslim men in almost all abattoirs in Australia, with the exception of those dealing in pigs, so that nearly all the meat we buy is halal certified, has happened silently and stealthily. We all know people, even have good friends who are Muslims, but if we allow elements such as halal certification to creep into our everyday lives, then we are encouraging, even paying for, radicalisation that had recent dire consequences in Sydney, Paris and Belgium. We do not want ghettos governed by Sharia law in Australia. D. Hicks Beckenham. Halal certification is one of those things that really bothers me, these arguments around it. I made a video about it ages ago on YouTube, and it always seems to garner comments from people along these lines. So first of all, it's a stupid slippery slope argument that somehow halal certification on processed food and on meat is somehow Sharia by stealth. It simply isn't. Allowing, as you would put it, halal certification is not somehow going to lead us into Sharia ghettos. There is no causal link there. And here's the reason why. So there's two slightly separate things here. So here in Australia, almost all of our meat is halal, is butchered in accordance with halal. The reason for this is because we have large export markets to Muslim-dominated countries. So Indonesia and Pakistan and the Middle East are large markets for our meat, particularly Indonesia and places like that. And so a large amount of our meat goes to Indonesia. As a result, it needs to be halal in order to be sold there because of well, it doesn't have to be, but there's so many Muslims there that the market is Muslims in Indonesia, and therefore it needs to be halal for those consumers, otherwise they won't eat it. So, as a result, abattoirs started producing halal-certified meat. Turns out that it's such a large proportion of meat that's exported, and it's relatively trivial differences in the butchering, when it comes down to it, that basically it was easier to just simply produce all meat halal, rather than doing some halal and some not halal. And so, basically, almost all of the abattoirs that service some kind of export market are now halal. Now, people would say, well, isn't that driving the prices up because they have to pay for halal certification? The result actually is quite the opposite. Because there's these large overseas markets, that has led to a large economy of scale here. So we are raising, butchering and selling a lot more meat than just the small Australian market. So that means that abattoirs can be much more efficient. And in the end, it actually pays for itself. And so the cost to the Australian consumer for meat is actually subsidised by the export market. So meat, the reason why it is almost all the abattoirs that are halal certified is because it makes actually good commercial sense. If there was an impost, if there was a large financial impost as a result of this, then other abattoirs, or some abattoirs, would choose not to be certified and would be able to outcompete the halal certified abattoirs here. And the fact that that hasn't happened and is unlikely to happen goes to show that it is actually quite a commercially viable arrangement. In fact, it's good for the abattoirs to be exporting halal certified meat. Now, packaged food is slightly different. So when you talk about Kraft Foods and Cadbury, these are large multinational corporations. So they process a lot of foods in various places around the world, and they export from those places to several markets. And they too benefit from economies of scale. So Kraft Foods peanut butter, for example, that is sold here, isn't just made and produced for the Australian market. It's also produced in the same factories in places around the world for the whole of the Asian market, essentially, and probably through to the Middle East. We are essentially one massive market. As a result of that, it needs to be halal. Now, halal is different from just the butchering. So there's a particular kind of butchering, which we generally talk about as being halal butchering, and there's a particular word for that, but I've forgotten. But halal just means allowed in Arabic. So there's haram, which is forbidden, and there's halal, which is allowed. It just basically means the same as kosher. So any food which is allowed to be eaten by Muslims is deemed halal food. That doesn't mean that the peanuts are slaughtered in accordance with Islamic traditions. It just means that there's nothing in that peanut butter which is forbidden to Muslims. Now, as an atheist, I think the whole thing is completely ridiculous, but one of the benefits is, by having food produced for many countries at once, is that the relatively small Australian market, we get food which is cheaper because it is mass-produced for much bigger markets. And yes, that makes it halal certified, and yes, there is a cost associated with that. But overall, Australian consumers have benefited from being part of these large Asian markets, which have significant Muslim populations, and therefore halal certification is necessary. There's always this suggestion that somehow it is linked to radical terrorists. Now, as far as I can tell, this is pure racism. So nobody suggests that, say, kosher certification schemes for Jews, or the Heart Foundation tick of approval, which is another certification scheme, somehow the money goes to terrorists. But because the terrorists are Muslim, and this halal is a Muslim thing, that somehow there must be a connection, which misses a huge amount of the link between. Now, the authorities here are very big on trying to stop the funding of terrorism. And if there was any evidence or suggestion that the certification schemes that are being run here are funding terrorists, I would expect the authorities to be doing something very much about that. And the fact that I haven't seen anything about it either means that there's no actual evidence there, or perhaps that they're investigating as we speak, and eventually people will be arrested. And it's this trying to tie this halal certification to Sharia law and Islamic radicals pisses me off totally, because, well, mostly people who talk about this stuff don't understand what the hell Sharia is, or Sharia law, or halal. They just think of it as stonings and beheadings and chopping hands off, and wearing burqas, which is the objectionable parts of Sharia. On the other hand, a large part, some would say even the majority of Sharia, is simply commandments to Muslims about how they should live their lives. And I have no issue with companies producing halal food, as long as it's not. And look, people talk about the cruelty involved in halal. We have fairly rigorous standards here about animal cruelty, and there are exemptions for ritual religious practices, which includes kosher as well as halal, and I would be happy to get rid of those personally. And I think there are legitimate issues around the employing of Muslims only to do this kind of slaughter, about religious discrimination there. But all I ever hear is, if we allow Sharia, if we allow them to halal certify our peanut butter, the next thing you know, we'll all be wearing burqas, and that is just absolute rubbish. Next up, Ernies pipe dream, 22nd of January 2015. Chinese engineers have built a dam in southern China to supply water to Beijing, 1,200 kilometres away. As the dam is 120 metres above sea level, the water flows under its own gravity through a series of pipelines and canals to the capital. Now, where are all our expert engineers who said it can't be done? Clive Cooper, Lancelin. So there's well, let's go back a little bit. So when the goldfields here in Western Australia were first discovered, and there was a gold rush, there was an issue with water supply. The goldfields here are very much inland, and there is very little water there. And there's a big sort of Western Australian local history thing about a pipeline that was built to pump water to Kalgoorlie in the goldfields. And there's a lot of local history around that. All WA school people should probably learn this, or at least did when I was going through it. Anyway, on the back of that, when Perth started experiencing significant water shortages over the last sort of 10 to 20 years, there was mooted a plan to ship water from the north of the state to Perth. And we are talking here a very long distance. We're talking about the length of going from, say, pumping water from Russia to the UK, or pumping water from Colorado to New York. These are long distances. But because it's WA, there's really nothing in between the two. So it's not like you're pumping through towns or whatever. It's literally across the desert. The problem with all of this is that it's incredibly inefficient. It would cost a hell of a lot of money to build the pipeline that long. It would take a hell of a lot of labour, and there'd be massive losses of water and energy along the way. And so whenever people have suggested this, other people have come back and sort of said that this is a stupid idea, and that we would be better off doing things like desalination, which is what we're doing, or looking at finding more groundwater, or even just water efficiency measures, that if we can actually improve our efficiency, we can gain more water than we could possibly pipe by pipeline or canal. Now, it is true that China has this massive plan to shift huge amounts of water from the south of China to the north to Beijing, and it is about, as you say, 1,200 kilometres long, and we're talking staggering amounts of water. Now, the problem here is that all of those issues that we talked about in terms of the problems here are exactly the same problems they're having in China. It is incredibly expensive. We're talking $80 billion so far, and they're nowhere near finished. We're talking about huge amounts of losses of water. The amount of water lost through the pumping is massive. Now, they've got it better than we do, because they can at least pump it to different towns along the way, and cities along the way. Here in Perth, we can't do that, because we have no cities between the north of the state and Perth. There literally isn't anything that would count as a city, except perhaps Geraldton. And so it costs a hell of a lot, and you lose a lot of the water along the way. The other thing that China has that we don't have is a large supply of basically cheap labour. So labour in WA is incredibly expensive, and so the building of this would be a massive it would be even more expensive than it is in China. China, they have a large supply of cheap labour, and they have basically a totalitarian government that can just decide to do these massive infrastructure projects for often just national pride reasons, which is what they're doing. And let's be straight here. None of the engineers ever said that it wasn't possible to pipe water from the north of the state to the south. It's not an engineering problem. From an engineering perspective, it's quite possible. There's nothing particularly complex about building pipelines and canals to pump water from one end of the state to the other. To do it cheaply and efficiently, that is what's impossible. And China is doing it neither cheaply nor efficiently. In fact, there's concerns that the water that they're pumping is going to be so expensive that nobody will be able to buy it in Beijing, apart from the mega rich. In fact, it's something about 6 times cheaper to just desalinate water here in Perth rather than to ship it. Anyway, so that's why we don't want this stupid bloody pipeline canal idea here in WA. It's just too expensive. Fivestar prison regime, 26th of January 2015. I read Daniel Emerson's article on Acacia Prison with disgust, The West, 22nd of January 2015. He highlighted how soft the life is for prisoners inside our jails, explaining how prisoners could enrol in a course in just about any trade while eating Harvey beef with mustard jus, then perhaps stroll to music class or yoga. I wonder if the victims, or the people and family affected by these prisoners, are enjoying the same comforts. Why would anybody be afraid to go to prison in Western Australia? Sounds more akin to a 5-star resort than a place for society's misfits. Brian Cameron, Osborne Park. You, like many other people, fundamentally misunderstand what prisons are about. The point of a prison is that you go to prison as punishment, not for punishment. That is, the punishment that we are putting on you is a loss of freedom. Not that you should go and live under harsh conditions. You should live under basic conditions, which should be a sort of a minimum set for all people in our society, whether in jail or not. Now, there are people outside of jail who are not living as well as people in jail, and the solution to that should be to try and raise the standards of living of those people, not to make it harder for people in jail. Nobody should be afraid of going to jail. Nobody should be afraid that when they go to jail, they are going to be treated brutally, or they are going to be raped, or they are going to be beaten. People should not be afraid of jail. People should be placed in a position where they make a rational choice, where they go, if I have these opportunities in my life to do X, Y, and Z. If I work hard, I'll get somewhere in life. If I commit crime, I will lose my freedom, which is the preferable option, to not lose my freedom. Therefore, I'm not going to commit crime. We shouldn't be trying to scare people out of committing crime in that sense. The loss of freedom, no matter how well you are treated, should be frightening enough. Now, the other thing is you have subtly slipped into your letter this idea that prisoners can just choose to enrol in a course, and then they eat their lovely food, and they wander off and do some yoga or a music class. And embedded in that is this idea of freedom. And people in prison, even in the most lovely of prisons, don't have that freedom. They don't have freedom of movement, they don't have freedom of association, and they don't have freedom of choice in a lot of this. So, as somebody who's worked in the prison system here, in particular, would know that they don't get to just do that. So if they sign up for a yoga class, that usually means that they have to put in a form weeks in advance to put their, to apply to be considered. They'll then be screened, blah, 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 blah. And if they get through that process and they're accepted, then it means that at a particular time of day, they then have to go up to the guard and ask the guard if they can then go to their class. They will then be confirmed that they are allowed to go to the class. They will then be buzzed in order to do a controlled movement to where the class is, where they will then arrive. They will then have to identify themselves to the guard. The guard will then work out that they should be there, or if there's a mistake, not, and then there will be dramas and they'll get sent back. They will then be allowed into the class, they'll do the class, and that's good. And then they have to go back, going through the whole rigmarole all the way back to their accommodation unit or their cell. The point being that there isn't this freedom of just, I'm going to go to my class, I'm just going to wander off to my class and wander back. Oh, I'm going to do my course, I wander. All of their movements, their day-to-day lives, are scheduled and controlled, because that's what part of losing your freedom entails here. And so, yes, there's a yoga class. And part of the reason why we do these things, actually, is because it is good for society, not necessarily just good for the prisoner. So prisoners who have some, and it's not even just any course they want, it is always job courses for the kinds of jobs that prisoners could get. So when you're an ex-prisoner, there is a limitation on the kind of jobs you can get. And so the kind of courses they're offering are things like construction, which, thanks to the mining boom, have actually better paid than they've traditionally been. But we are generally looking at low-skilled jobs because the kinds of courses you can do in a prison setting are not generally that good. So not terrible jobs, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, but it isn't any job they want. It isn't any course they want that they can enrol in. It's things like bricklaying and carpentry and metalwork and welding and things like that, which is fine if that's what you're into. But it isn't the free choice. And when you say halve your beef with mustard stew, that's a lovely way of saying mincemeat with sauce. That's all it is, okay? And if you can put a nice label on it, and it is probably fairly nice food, but it isn't this great thing that nobody else is eating in WA. It's the kind of food that even poor people have access to now. And so, the point of the prison is to deprive people of their freedom, and at the same time try and rehabilitate them so that they will be good citizens upon their return to society. Now, all of the evidence that we have, internationally and WA-based, is that the better we treat people, and I don't even mean better, if we treat people humanely and as we would treat the worst of our society, i.e. basic standard of living with, access to opportunity as best we can, then they will come out the other end as more likely to be productive members of society. We're only shooting ourselves in the foot by treating prisoners badly. And if you want to see that in action, just look at other societies around the world where they do treat their prisoners poorly. I mean, look at America. The treatment of, a large number of the prison population really terribly has not given benefits to society. It doesn't dissuade people from committing crime, and if anything, it makes it even worse. And I personally wouldn't want to live in a society like that. Lastly for this week, Refugee advice, 27th of January 2015. With all the self-mutilation going on in the Manus Island refugee camp by the illegal immigrants, it is as obvious as night follows day that the refugee advocates are advising these people what to do to gain entry into Australia. It would be interesting to know where the money is coming from to pay these advisors. I hope it's not the Australian taxpayer. Sydney Smith, Bayswater. So we're back to refugees. I knew it couldn't last. We've been a little bit free of refugee issues recently. So, yes, there's been recent reports of refugees sewing their lips shut and going on hunger strikes. Now, the problem with what you're suggesting here is that I'm aware of no evidence that committing self-harm acts actually get refugees to Australia any quicker. As far as I can tell, it doesn't expedite their case. It doesn't make them any more likely to be settled here as refugees. And so I don't think there is any actual benefit, except perhaps to to get more attention to the plight of refugees generally. And maybe perhaps some media attention. I think it's very unlikely to actually affect the processing of their case one way or the other. And if it did, that is an indictment on our current government rather than anything else. That the government shouldn't be making decisions based on the self-harm of 1 or 2 or 3 refugees or asylum seekers. It should be based on a sober assessment of whether these people are actually in fear and in danger for their lives, not on what are their behaviour during incarceration here, especially. I mean, what we know about self-harm is overwhelmingly self-harm is motivated by a hopelessness that comes from being incarcerated, one, with no time frame on it, and without an understanding of what your situation is, and certainly in places like Manus Island, in the middle of nowhere. These are hopeless conditions to be in, especially for the incredibly vulnerable people who end up in them. Most asylum seekers themselves have experienced a lot of trauma. There are pregnant women, there are children there as well. There are people who are incredibly vulnerable, and locking them up interminably with no set date for release, no idea about how long it's going to take, no very poor health, especially mental health facilities to them, so they don't have any help to deal with that situation, and not necessarily any legal access either. Part of the reason why we do offshore processing is so that they don't have any access to our normal legal processes here. So they don't have any kind of unbiased representation. It's them against this system, and they're just interned. We know that those are the kind of things that cause mental health problems and things like self-harm. I would be very surprised if people were telling them that refugee advocates were telling them, oh yeah, if you self-harm, you'll get resettled in Australia. If that were the case, I would expect far more incidents of self-harm than what we are seeing. What we're seeing is probably about on par with what you expect from just the horrible treatment that they are receiving. And the other thing is, yes, they're not paid for by the Australian taxpayer because, and I can say this absolutely, because I know that nothing is being paid for apart from their incarceration. So they are not getting independent legal advice. They're not getting access, they're not even getting access to lawyers, they're not getting access to advocates, they don't get access to even volunteer groups like Amnesty International and various church organisations that want to just provide humanitarian care are generally not allowed any access to them at all. And so these refugee advocates who work tirelessly to get some contact with them and help them out are funded generally by community groups and charities. Particularly, there's an offshoot of Get Up called the Australian Asylum Seeker Resource Centre or something, which does a lot of the work in that area. So it's not being paid for by the Australian taxpayer, which I also think is to our shame. If we are going to lock people up indefinitely under a system of Byzantine and arcane processes that no educated, reasonable Australian could make their way through, let alone traumatised people fleeing persecution, I think we actually do have a right to provide them with some kind of advocate. But there you go, that's modern day Australia. Out of sight, out of mind, illegal immigrants. Anyway, that's it for me this week. I hope you're all doing well. I, as always, feel somewhat better for having had a bit of a rant. Happy Australia Day to all my fellow Australians for yesterday. Hope you're all doing well. And I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.